No? Yeah, amazing. Hi everyone and welcome to our event, or bem-vindos and bem-vindas, as you say in Brazilian Portuguese. It's really exciting to have almost a full room here today, so thank you so much for making the time to talk about this really exciting topic, which is gender and climate justice. So this is our powerful COP26 side event titled Ambition on Gender and Climate Action, Global Young Feminists on Gender and Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights, which is basically a huge, powerful event of intergenerational dialogue with some powerful young people from all over the world. So again, thank you so much for being here and for spending the next 1 hour and 15 minutes with us. So let me just start by introducing myself. My name is Renate Okavaringa. I'm 24 years old. I'm a climate justice advocate from Brazil, also a public policy student at Harvard University, and the founder and director of Empoderra Clima, which is a gender and climate justice youth initiative, part of Care About Climate, a youth nonprofit from all over the world. We're hosting this event not just in the role of Care About Climate and Empoderra Clima, but also in the partnership with the Gender Working Group of YOUNGO, which is the youth constituency of the UN Climate Change Convention, and also with the UNFPA. So we're really glad to have everyone on board to talk about such a pressing issue at COP26. And I think, as you all know, because you're all here, COP26 is all about ambition. So I think everyone's aware that when we talk about ambition, we have to talk about gender justice and intergenerational equity, especially when it comes to including young women and girls, specifically indigenous young women, Black young women from the Global South. So it's really important that we're having these discussions. And the idea here today is exploring how countries have been adopting, or not, intersectional policies in their climate action work at the national level and also at the local level, and to understand how youth leaders can take the lead to either change the scenario or enhance that ambition as much as we can in the next few years. So to deliver our opening remarks, I would first like to invite Sauka, the head of the cross-cutting issues of the UK government negotiation team of COP26, to take the floor.
Thank you. Can I just check that the mic is working here? Hi everyone, and so great to see such a full room. As Renata says, my name is Salka and I head up cross-cutting issues for the COP26 presidency. And that means I lead the team that leads on gender, which is really exciting. You may have heard us talk about this, but we've always said that we're committed to an inclusive presidency, and I just want to say what that means to us, and it's very much to amplify the voices of those whose voices are most often marginalized. And in particular, if you think about women and girls, we know that climate change has a disproportionate impact on women and girls. But it's not just about looking at them as a victim, but recognizing the agency of change that women and girls bring to the climate change table. Because if you recognize all voices, you're much more likely to get better solutions, because you factor in all the different perspectives that are out there, including gendered perspectives. And for us, it's very important to take an intersectional approach to gender and recognize overlapping barriers many women face due to other characteristics, due to race, disability, age, being indigenous, and recognize, as I say, those often call it layers of marginalization, so it's not just one group, but many. You may have all known that COP25 agreed the Gender Action Plan, which is a real stepping stone to set direction to countries and stakeholders for how to implement gender-responsive climate action and enable full and meaningful leadership of women and girls. And for us as a presidency, we've always had two objectives in this regard. First is to implement the Gender Action Plan ourselves into UK national frameworks, but equally use our presidency position to encourage other parties and stakeholders to take action on the Gender Action Plan. So it's calling for gender-responsive local, national and global climate action and champion women and girls' agency and adaptation and advancing gender in climate finance. So it's very much linking up policies and plans and finance so that climate change and gender are addressed hand in hand. Now you may know that we're hosting Gender Day next Tuesday. And we're linking this with the UN Women convened Action Coalition on the Feminist Action for Climate Justice, And we see this initiative as being sort of a rule book of the Gender Action Plan and recognising the different international frameworks. So the focus of our high-level event at 11 o'clock on Tuesday will be to see global leaders come forward with new and strengthened commitments on that practical implementation, gender and climate, because there's so many initiatives and agreements out there, but ultimately we need to see countries and stakeholders take action on the national implementation of those frameworks and come forward with very clear plans for how they're going to achieve gender-responsive climate action. I also want to address sexual and reproductive rights, which I know is the focus of this discussion today. We have a bespoke UK team working on this back in London, and I'll try to do their work justice. But climate impacts has a severe impact on sexual and reproductive rights, and investment in them has to be part of climate policy, and that is really an investment in climate resilience. And that includes building inclusive, resilient health systems and ensuring minimum standards of service provision after climate disasters, but also means building political systems that protect sexual and reproductive rights, even in times of crisis, and that includes a climate crisis. And it's very much about making sure health systems are resilient, sustainable, and inclusive, and services need to be accessible to women and girls, but equally LGBTQI people, people with disabilities, people living with HIV or AIDS or adolescents, and other excluded or stigmatized groups or marginalized voices, as I talked about earlier. So it's about ensuring that sexual and reproductive rights are embedded in climate change planning and in climate finance from the UK, but equally from others, and invest in resilient health and wider sexual and reproductive health services. So just to summarize, because I know we've got an exciting discussion coming up and I don't want to take up all the space, but in all of our COP26 work, we're very much committed to amplifying women's voices and ensuring women and girls, particularly the most marginalized, can lead our work to build resilience and tackle emissions, and in line with the Gender Action Plan, which we're very much focusing on. And I always welcome coming discussions like this to learn. I'm always very transparent that I might not be the expert of everything, but I want to learn and listen, and it's people like you that give us the solutions. So thanks very much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Sauka. It's really important to have that perspective of decision makers, especially being here at COP26 as such a high-level event. So we really appreciate you being here and bringing your perspective and all of the policies that you're implementing on gender justice. So now, continuing on the opening remarks, I'd like to invite Dr. Angela Baschieri, Population Policy Dynamics Advisor and co-lead of the UNFPA Climate Change Workstream, to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Renata, and it's my pleasure to be here today at this exciting side session. UNFPA work on acknowledge that climate change has an impact on maternal health, on access to family planning, and has an impact on the rate of gender-based violence. We also work quite closely on youth. So we have a youth global strategy, and we ensure that the youth are empowered and their voice is being listened, and they are active part of society and the work and we support the youth-led organization. In the last few years, we have been scale up the work on the relationship between the impact of climate change and SRHR, and we have developed our value proposition. So we wanted to see what are the programmatic action, what can we actually do on the ground to really change the way we do program in a way that acknowledge that climate change has an impact on the way women access services and also on the underlying health and vulnerability. So we develop what we call a value proposition, and we look at different pillars of engagement. And the first pillar is looking at how we empower young people and community. So all programming, they look at the specific aspect from a bottom-up approach. The second pillar of work is around strengthening system. And when we talk about system, it's not just health system, but it's protection system. The third pillar of work is about ensuring that we have protection and preparedness on emergency response. We know that these crises are not a rare event anymore, they are recurrent event, and so how we ensure that we are planning ahead. And the fourth pillar is ensuring that we have an understanding of the data and underlying condition of the population that we serve. So it's trying to step up on assessment of vulnerability that address the impact on women. So we have started our work, and we have launched some different type of activity, including establishing a joint working group of climate activists that are interested in SRHR, and we are essentially providing the platform for that voice. We have also developed a comprehensive sexuality education integrated programming, where I look at the aspect of SRHR and climate change education to really give a voice, and we are hoping in the next few years we can move it as an online platform and reach a much larger audience. We have also working on other programmatic modality, but the importance of this event today is really the voice of the youth. And we are, as part of one of our mandate activities, really empowering young people to be agent of change and to really bring new idea and solution. So I'm going to stop here today. I know you have an exciting conversation ahead, and I want to take more time, but I'm a pleasure to be here and co-organizing the event with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Angela, and thank you to you both for giving your opening remarks. I think this really sets the tone of why we're here today, why we need to discuss this, and why this is the most urgent matter that we have, because we really can't have climate justice if we're not considering the most affected groups, as you both had brilliantly said in your opening remarks, so thank you. And now we're gonna move on to our powerful youth panel. We have amazing youth speakers with us today, young leaders from all over the world, from the UK, from Brazil, Japan, Nigeria, who are gonna provide a lot of their perspectives on gender and climate justice in the national climate plans, in the NDCs, and how we can do better, because I really do think that we can all do better in including those policies, those intersectionalities in the work we're doing nationwide. So thank you all so much for being here. I do have all of your bios, but I think it's much cooler if we're able to have you introduce yourselves in your own words and talk to you a little bit about your work, the amazing and powerful initiatives that you're working on, and your thoughts on this issue. So in order to start off, I would like to invite Karina Penha, who's a biologist and inspiring social environmentalist from Brazil, to take the power and deliver her remarks. Thank you, Karina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Just no, because I don't know. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to stay here today. I'm very happy because, as Renata said, I am a biologist. I am from Brazil, the northeast of Brazil, one of the poorest parts of Brazil, and I live in a periphery. I am a girl, I'm a black woman, I am Christian, so talk about gender is really a thing that for me make me happy, because we don't have a lot of places that we can talk about this like we have today here. And we know that it's very difficult to stay here, and when you are from the countries like Brazil, it's very difficult to talk about a lot of things, and gender is a thing that for us, it's harder sometimes to talk about. But for me, I have worked with youth people from Brazil, different areas of Brazil for 7 years, and I was the coordinator of Engajamundo, working group on climate change, and today I idealize the Muvuca. It is a local program of climate change for activists from the Amazon. Where I live, it is in the region of the Amazon region. And we have a lot of things to talk when you can say what you think about gender issues. And when I was invited to analyze the NDC, it was, I can talk about this now or just to introduce myself?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was very happy because I am part of a group in Brazil that it is the group of the Observatory of Climate that working in gender and climate. And for us, we have a lot of women for many ages, and I know that I am a young woman, but we can talk with a lot of women of many ages and areas, and today we are a great group. And when I was invited to talk about the NDC, I could use a lot of reference of this group. You can see it after if you can. And it was very surprising for me because for many years I am here in the COPs trying to get more young people, more women, more black people to this space, because when you talk about Brazilian issues, we know that we have a lot of problems. And today especially because we have a governmental, very difficult to talk about Amazon and other things, and gender, it's very difficult also. And when I was analyzing the NDC, it's very difficult to see that sometimes there is just a mention of gender in the NDC. I don't know about your countries, but for us, that there is a big country as Brazil, important culture of Latin America, it is very difficult to know about this. Because we have a lot of people from the civil society working to get more spaces to talk about gender. But we have the other side, people that have power that cannot hear us, so cannot see, listen us. So for me, it was very interesting also to understand more about when you talk about the NDC and political things and climate agenda, what we can consider, that we are really consider the woman in these spaces, because sometimes in NDC you can see a mention like if the woman were the stakeholders of this space. When you are walking here, we can see a lot of women. When I don't know if you have the opportunity to visit the Brazil Climate Action Hub. It is the space of the civil society, and we can see a lot of women. The women are making a lot of things. You can see Renata from Brazil. But sometimes in the spaces of decision making, we don't have this presence. So this is very, very difficult to know, because why? This is the COP26. And why a lot of people from Brazil, this morning I was walking and seeing the two spaces of Brazil in this conference. And it's very difficult. The civil society is a lot of women, but when you talk about scientific places and political places, we cannot see women. And sometimes in the NDC and other things, also in the gender things, when you talk about the UNFCCC, we just can see the women and girls in the adaptation part. Because sometimes it don't talk about the science. Because, okay, the women are the most vulnerable people. And now, that's why today in Brazil, when you make reference about the NDC, and when you can talk with our governmental people about the NDC, we always talk that the women are not the most vulnerable people. Because we are making a lot. We are making a lot. We are here. This is very hard, but we are here today. So that's why we are trying to change the kind of word or the way that we talk about gender in the NDC, and how the subnationals, governmental, I don't know if there is the correct words, but are working today in Brazil. And when you talk about the Amazon region, this is really difficult because we don't have a lot of references. Brazil is a very different country. We have a lot of communities, we have a lot of indigenous people, we have a lot of people from the peripheries, and that's why we talk about youths and not so youth. That's also, we talk about women and not about women. And that was a little of my experience, analyze the NDC. You can see more about this. I put there a lot of references of the groups that work today in Brazil. And now we want to have more opportunity to talk about this, and also to have a lot of things to help and to stay present in space like that, not just here, but also in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. That was very powerful, and I think very on point as to the current situation in Brazil and why it's so important that we need young women, especially young Black women and young Indigenous women, on the front lines of not just climate action as we see back home, but here, right? And that's not really the case, unfortunately. So thank you so much for that. And now I would like to move on to our next wonderful youth speaker to take the power, Mayumi Sato, who's a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. You have the floor.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, as mentioned, my name is Mayumi. I go by she and her, and I am from Japan, and I'm a PhD student. I also had the privilege and opportunity of doing the gender analysis like Karina of Japan's NDC, so I'll just talk a bit about my reflections. So if I look at Japan, the issue of gender is still a very taboo topic. We often suppress the issue with the hope of eliminating it as a discussion point. But the problem with this is that my country has equated the notion of development as something that is equal to economic prosperity and success. And because of this, we've kind of created this false binary between what is developed and what is developing, when oftentimes this characterization is often very misleading. The problem with Japan is that by all economic metrics, we may be seen as developed. But in reality, if you look at our social and gendered landscapes, there's nothing really developed about a country where arguably half of our country's population doesn't have the same amount of agency to live a fulfilling life or to make a decision unencumbered by the patriarchal norms of our society. So when you actually look at the NDCs that were submitted, for instance, in 2016, only 64 of them alluded to women or gender. And the interesting thing is that many of these countries come from the global south. So although we may have this paternalistic attitude, oftentimes from wealthy global north countries, often colonial countries, of being developed versus being developing, I think that looking at gender and how it's mainstreamed and discussed within climate discourse can actually give us a good glimpse on why we need to shift this narrative on what it really means to be developed. In regards to Japan's updated NDC submission, yes, of course, we've managed to increase our commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from 26% to 46%. But according to the Climate Action Tracker, Japan will actually need to reduce more than 60% below 2013 levels by 2030 to be consistent with the 1.5 degree Celsius target. So specifically, some of the things that I recommended in this analysis is for the Ministry of Environment to collect gender disaggregated data on sectoral workforces, like the energy sector and also those who participate in climate policy spaces. And I say this because most recently we talk a lot about this just transition, but if we look at the renewable sector, we see a heavily gender imbalanced sector. And so when we talk about gender in the NDCs, it's not just about pointing the problems, but also providing an opportunity for how we can actually improve women's participation in the workforce while also addressing the gender imbalances and hierarchies within society. I think a lot of the other speakers already alluded to this point, which is that all systems of oppression are connected, and so whether that's the climate crisis or racism or classism, we know that these issues are all interlinked. And we know that with increased and unexpected patterns of flooding and heat waves and poor air pollution, this will disproportionately affect women, children, folks from the global south, and older people. And this last point is particularly critical in my home country because Japan is a heavily aging population, and Japanese women are amongst the longest living population groups in the world. And so we need to ensure that not only are we living longer lives, but we're also living meaningful and healthy lives. So planning for the gendered impacts and consequences of climate change and safeguarding these adverse impacts through climate policy is also equally critical. Before I finish, I just want to digress slightly from the content of Japan's NDCs and the absence of gender in our existing policies, because like Karina mentioned, you can go to the website and see what we've written. But I do want to emphasize something else, and that is that we need to think about why there is an erasure of our voices to begin with. It's not just about bringing a few people up here and cherry picking a few select women to speak on all women's behalf. Of course, representation does matter, but when we're looking at building equitable NDCs, we really need to interrogate the systems of oppression that actually undergird why women and young girls don't have opportunities in the first place, and especially as we're talking about the climate space, why they don't have opportunities to participate in climate policy. So in order to do this, it really involves coming to a national reckoning with the historical injustices and systemic oppression of our own countries. And doing this gender analysis, it really allowed me to think critically about my home country and get honest and even uncomfortable with my country's past and present. So this means that understanding that Japan's exclusion of women relates to our colonial past and the way that we even abused comfort women during the war. It also means that understanding our exclusion of women relates to the way that Okinawan women are repeatedly violated due to military presence and occupation, in which, interestingly enough, not a lot of people know that military and war is one of the biggest contributions to carbon emissions. This means understanding that the exclusion of women relates to the fact that on an average day in Japan, a Japanese woman commuting to work may be molested or violated on a crowded train. This means understanding that women in Japan are often relegated to low-paying administrative jobs and are often expected to stay at home and take care of multiple generations of family members. These are just a few of the many realities of how the patriarchy manifests into our everyday lives and affects our ability to participate socially and professionally. So while we can sit here and question why women aren't included in policy making, we also should recognize that when we talk about gender, we're talking about the legacies of intergenerational and systemic injustice. And if we truly want to build a just NDC, then we also have to understand that we need the right infrastructure and the landscape on which we can actually go forward with producing a gender-just NDC. And lastly, just to wrap up, I just want to say that we are all able to be here because we have the privilege of being able to speak English. And somehow we've accepted and normalized this fact that English is going to be the centralized mode of knowledge production, when in fact we're actually limiting ourselves by doing this because so many people's voices and narratives are excluded if they don't conform to this hegemonic language. And so when we think about this as it relates to gender, we also need to think about why we need to include greater narratives around gender into climate spaces, and especially when it comes to climate policies. We need to be aware and open-minded about listening to and accepting diverse forms of meaning making, and that will improve our approach to addressing the climate crisis. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Mayumi. That was also very powerful, and I was just writing a lot of notes here. Very, very inspired about what you said, and especially the connection to colonialism, which I think is the reality of many countries, especially in the global south, and how that translates to what we're facing now in climate policy, but also in every policy-making decision or every policy-making issue that we're discussing. So thank you so, so much for that. Before moving on, I just want to make two notes. One, both Mayumi and Karina mentioned the analysis. So just so you know, that was part of this big project that we did this year, is Care About Climate, to make an effort to center young people in analyzing the updated NDCs, the updated nationally determined contributions of their own countries, and see if in those updated NDCs of 2020 and 2021, there was any progress, not just in terms of including gender as a wording or just in the language, but also in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and leadership. So they were both our amazing ambassadors for Japan and Brazil, and we can later provide the link so that you can read those amazing analyses and recommendations by them. And then also the next note is that, unfortunately, Cherno, who's on the slide right there, could not join us today, but we do have an amazing speaker, Zainab from Nigeria, who's here, and she's going to be speaking right after Henrietta, so just so you all know about this small change that we made in the program. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Henrietta Wood, who's the representative of the Youngo Gender Working Group, to take the power. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So I'm Henrietta. I'm part of the Young Women in Gender Working Group. And I think from a young age, I was always like, I'm definitely a feminist, but I always cared about climate change and the environment, but I never linked the two, and I feel like that's what governments don't do either. They don't link the two together. And the Youngo has provided me the opportunity to be able to explore that further, and hopefully I can kind of talk to you about that today. And I believe it's paramount that we take women's and girls' rights seriously. I don't think that's much to ask. But when I was reading some of the NDCs, I was quite dismayed how some of them just simply ignore how powerful gender equality can be in combating climate change, and also how climate change disproportionately impacts women and girls. Last COP, the parties all agreed a 5-year enhanced Lima work programme on gender and climate action plan. It aims to advance knowledge and understanding of gender-responsive climate action and meaningful women's participation in UNFCCC processes. However, I question whether it's a gender action plan or a gender promise plan. Last year, She Changes Climate claimed that men took up 10 out of 12 UK COP26 leadership positions. This has fortunately improved, but as we see in the NDCs, the intersection of gender and climate change is rarely acknowledged, never mind accompanied to a strong implementable mechanism. And I think that's representative of the UK and its UK NDC when I was reading it, and the UK has a huge responsibility. It's obviously a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but it also has a huge history of colonialism, and the UK is thus complicit in not putting the most marginalised voices first. The UK's NDC's mentions of gender, women and girls is shockingly diminutive. Although I say shockingly, it doesn't actually surprise me that much. There are a few mentions of getting women and girls into STEM subjects, so like science and renewable technology, which is great, and it's part of the gender action plan to get girls into those kind of subjects. But there was no mention of SRHR, which is sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it isn't just the UK that's lacking, it's pretty much every country. It's getting better, but we don't have any time to wait. It's despite the fact that UN figures say 80% of climate refugees are women, and as I'll go into more detail, it's the girls and women who are hardest hit by climate change. I'm not surprised. How are we going to see climate justice when women, firstly, aren't being heard, but secondly, aren't being listened to, and they're not at the decision-making table? There's not to mention the hypocrisy of governments mentioning climate justice and how they're going to transition into a better economy, better country. But like the UK, they're still building new oil fields like Cambo, or they're still only 0.01% of all climate finance is towards women and girls and the intersections with climate change, despite that being on part of the Enhanced Gender Action Plan. So as we can see, we can't just rely on government promises. Frontline communities don't have the time to wait for male majority cabinets to differ and deliberate on their climate policies. And as a result, women's empowerment and inclusive dialogue is essential, as demanded in the Gender Action Plan. The usual discourse, I think, around reproductive rights and population, for example, needs to change. For too long, we talk about population as opposed to simply empowering women to make choices about their own bodies, their own choices. And the NDCs shouldn't just mention climate change and gender, which firstly they don't really, but they need to implement SRHR strategies, like girls' education, deconstructing patriarchal systems like you spoke about, and promoting climate-resilient communities. I think it's terrible how we are still in this position where none of this is happening, or maybe it's starting to happen, but I don't think it's all of the governments that are enacting that change. And I'd just like to quickly come on to how climate change impacts sexual and reproductive health and rights, because I think it's really important to be transparent about all this. Women and girls who will miss out on school, unfortunately, will have to face even more dangerous and longer journeys to access vital resources such as water, which is obviously becoming scarcer due to climate change inflicted by the developed countries like the UK. And these journeys make women more vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation, a violation to their bodily integrity, their personal autonomy, also known as their human rights. And climate change makes extreme weather events more frequent and disastrous, obviously. Vital infrastructure like clinics will be destroyed, leading to negative SRHR outcomes. And climate change is also, finally, an indirect driver of child marriage, and financial distress following extreme weather puts girls the most at risk once again. All of these show how climate change threatens basic human rights, yet countries like mine barely even recognise the intersection of gender and climate change. So I'm tired of empty promise after empty promise after empty promise. And quite frankly, I'm tired of not even hearing gender and climate in the same sentence. And I want that to change, and it is changing thanks to the amazing work of global young feminists like we are, and hopefully pushing those governments to finally take action. So that's what I'd like to end with, is a call to action that's saying that there's so much more that needs to be done, and you just need to look at the amazing people like my other speakers just to show that it is possible. We just need to start putting girls at the forefront of it.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. That was also very powerful, and especially being a youth from the UK when we're having this COP here and outlining all of the issues and all of the barriers that we still have at the 26th COP. I think it's really important and really speaks to the urgency of this issue, and really highlighting as well and recognizing the importance of young activists and civil society in what we have today, such as the Gender Action Plan, being a result of many, many years of efforts by the gender and youth constituencies, for example. So now, finally, for our last speaker, last but not least, of this powerful youth panel, before we move on to the Q&A, I'd like to welcome Zainab Yunusa, who's the member of the UNFPA Joint Youth Working Group on Sexual Health and Reproductive Rights and Climate Change. You have the power.
Yeah, thank you, Renata. Can I just confirm that everybody can hear me? Great,
yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah. So, I'm Zainab Yunusa, thank you for having me here. I think for me, if I want to touch on how climate change has affected the sexual reproductive health and rights and gender equality among young people, it's just going to build on what the fellow panelists, what the speakers have mentioned. There is definitely a link between climate change and its impact on sexual reproductive health. It worsens the situation that already exists for girls, for women, young girls in particular. And I want to use a scenario of Nigeria, because I'm Nigerian, I'm very familiar with what is happening in Nigeria. So in the northeast of Nigeria, for instance, there has been cases of insurgencies. There has been insecurities that are happening, insurgencies happening in the northeast of Nigeria. And research studies have linked some of this to in a way that it is climate-induced. Some of these happenings are coming from conflicts arising from people trying to fight for scarce resources that have become scarce because of the effect of human beings, human activities on these resources. For instance, the Lake Chad region. So some of these has given rise to cases of terrorism, some of that we've had. We've had issues of these making people being displaced from their homes. I mean, since 2009, there's about, 1.7 million people that have been displaced, mostly women and girls there in the northeast of Nigeria. So, and then you have this situation going on. That means these people are already in a certain situation, unfortunate situation, because of impacts which can be linked to climate change. I think that is just very relevant enough to, if people are still trying to find it difficult to link, how has climate change got to do with some of this, that we're even talking about this in a climate change conference. We're bringing sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I keep insisting that it is very important, because when we have, for instance, those that are now displaced, we have them in internally displaced camps. These persons in the camps. We have young girls, we have young girls, we have women there. Now, in the northeast of Nigeria, mostly, first of all, I want to link it how it relates to how it affects girls' education before I get to sexual reproductive health and rights. So in Nigeria, Nigeria has the highest number of out-of-school children in the world, first of all. And then among this number, over 10 million of them, 60% are young girls. So that's already the cases that we have in ground. And then we now have climate-induced effects, climate change worsening some of this situation where these girls are now in camps. These girls are facing risk of early marriages. Some of them are being forced, some of them, that's the end of their education. Some of them are being forced into early marriages. Some of them, you know, they get exposed to risk of gender-based violence. And in such situations, some of these girls, there are unmet needs for sexual reproductive health and rights. Because it's so, I mean, it's double tragedy for a place like Nigeria because we're still at a state where we're trying to convince, there's still behavior change trying to go on to say, you know what, it's a right, girls and young people have rights to access such services. We're still trying to change the attitude and behavior of people to this. And then we now have the issue of climate change induced impact of climate change worsening the situation for these girls. Now, most of the time in these conflict settings, sexual and reproductive health and rights needs are not prioritized. They're not seen as basic needs. I mean, you try to say, okay, shelter for these people, but these are some of because these are not prioritized, it begins to have, I mean, social, mental health effects on most of these girls. We're having cases of unwanted pregnancies. We're having cases where most of them then go to abortion as a way out because most of the pregnancies are not intended. At the end of the day, more than half of that are ended by abortion. So you're risking their lives going into some of these, resolving to some of these, trying to resolve to these because they do not have options, because their needs, because nobody's thinking about, you know what, how about we think about their sexual and reproductive health and rights? And that's what I mean, I'm a gender advocate, I'm a sexual health and reproductive rights advocate. Where I always come in, what I always say is that we need, because I mean, it's just something, it's about accountability. When I think of it and having to explain myself too much, sometimes it starts to irritate me. Because if you're not having issues, if you're having these problems that climate change is contributing to, I think it is only fair to say climate change, we have to find a way that climate change adaptation becomes one of the solutions to the problem. When we're talking about financing, where we're saying, oh, you know what, we need money, we need resources to be able to provide emergent services for sexual and reproductive health for these girls, for these women, because of what is happening to them that climate change has caused. I think it's only fair, it's only logical, it's only reasonable when you're talking about needing these financing, needing all these resources, needing more research, because this is one of the key issues. There are little research in this area. You want to be able to back, I mean, data and fact and science is one of the things to get people to understand situations. How do you do these researches if they're not prioritized, if they're not even recognized? If they're not, and then, I mean, to cap everything all, we need to start accepting that, you know what, these are right-based needs. I mean, these are human beings that are entitled to these. First of all, you need to see them as a human being. You need to understand that they're entitled to this. And this is why, whenever I'm talking about this issue, I try to move away from people of the school of thought that see issue of sexual reproductive health as a mitigation strategy. Because I think it's only unfair if you're talking about cases where, you know what, we can only improve sexual reproductive health right needs because, oh, that way we tend to reduce the population, then there, you know, there's low carbon emission, and then everybody is fine. That's not fair, that's not true, because in most cases, when they're directing these narratives, most of the time, they're talking about women and girls in low-income or developing countries. You're talking about places in African regions because, oh, that's where the population is high. So you're trying to still put women and girls in a disadvantaged position to try to, in a way that you're preferring a false solution because you're not having their interests at heart. You're not going after trying to meet their needs for their health's sake. their mental state, for their, the body, the physical state. So that's not the overall interest. So I try to look at it from seeing people as human beings, trying to look after them, trying to make sure that their needs are being met, rather than coming from some theory of reducing population. So if you're really having the interest of these young people, how it is affecting their gender inequality is when we're looking at these approaches, it's just very simple. We need to include sexual and reproductive health and rights in our climate adaptation strategies. However, it's going to be included in all those long texts that we're writing. We need to understand, we need to know, and we need more funding, more finance to back research. And there definitely has to be collaboration between all these agencies and ministries. If we're trying to exchange knowledge down from the academia, down from young people in those places that are experiencing this, because it's one thing to have beautiful, nice intentions, to want to help people. It's another thing to get it all wrong by not even consulting them or not trying to understand their context and what their needs are at that point in time. So for me, these are just some of the things that I've seen from my experiences and how sexual reproductive health and rights come into play when we're talking about climate change and the impacts that it's having on us as young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab, for that powerful statement, especially focusing on sexual reproductive health and rights. I think it's not talked about enough, so it's really, really powerful that we're doing this here at such a privileged and high-level space, and in person and in such a feminist and powerful panel right here. So I hope you all realize how special this is and how important it is to be hearing these young women. So thank you to all four of you for your amazing opening remarks. We do have a Q&A session, so I have a few guiding questions just to get us started, but after that, please feel free to come up to the mics and formulate your questions. We would love to hear from you and get your perspective as well, and what we would like to hear from our powerful speakers today. So to get us started, I actually have a data here from UNFPA, from the NDC review, that shows that only 6 of the 50 reviewed countries mentioned sexual reproductive health and rights in their first NDCs. So in looking at that and in looking at the statistics that we have for the NDCs in general terms of gender and women's empowerment, I would like to know from whoever wants to take the floor, how can young people really drive that integration in the climate plans? Because I know we talk about the issues and we're all here, but we all know that this is the minority, right? Being able to be in this space and to talk to policymakers and negotiators. So how can we do or implement these responses on gender and climate justice in our own countries as young people, especially when the systems don't really allow us to do so by not having youth negotiators on their COP delegations or on these very powerful informal spaces? So if any of you wants to start us off on what you could do, so moving from the issues into the recommendations, it would be lovely to hear from you. Whoever wants to take the floor. Karina, you want to start? Okay. Yeah.
So, Renata, I think that we have making a lot of things. We have a lot of studies, we have a lot of products. I think that we just have to implement it. Especially in the Brazilian NDC, we have a lot of recommenders and things that we are making in civil society groups, and we just give to the governmental to implement. So we have a lot of products, we have a lot of studies, we have a lot of things that are happening in the communities, in the indigenous communities and traditional communities, that it's working. So I think that we can see what's working and we can implement in a political things. I was thinking about another thing that we are talking now about the gender action plan. And we were analyzing also the gender action plan in Brazil, and something very, very important, there is no mention about Black people in this gender action plan. And there is just a mention about traditional people, but this don't mean the same thing. because a lot of black people are in the peripheries when you talk about Brazil and Latin America and other countries of Global South. So I think that we cannot go on like that. We cannot implement things looking like that. Because as we are talking here today about our cultures and places that we live, we know about what we need and what can happen really in our communities. So I think that when you talk about the Brazilian NDC, exactly, we have a lot of things. We are making a lot. We just need to have space and opportunity to make it happen.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? Mayumi?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially when you look at the climate space, a lot of the work is quite siloed. So, you know, you have maybe very technical people who might be working on carbon sequestration. I don't really know what the mechanics of that is because I come from a very social scientist perspective. They aren't necessarily talking to people who are on the front lines, you know, indigenous land defenders, and they might not be talking to global civil society. And so I feel like there is a lot of work that's being done, but a lot of it is quite disjointed. But I think in terms of how do you actually integrate, you know, issues around sexual and reproductive health into NDCs and also climate policy, I think that one way that young people can actually create an intervention is already being done, especially if you look at like Sunrise Movement. They link the relationship between racism and climate change. I mean, I think our generation has had really nuanced discussions around intersectionality and understanding that different systems of oppression are related. And so if we can manage to do that, looking at how gender is related to climate justice and how that's related to reproductive health, I think that that's one way that we actually can just create an internal dialogue that could hopefully inform climate policy as we, you know, become policy makers ourselves and hopefully push that narrative forward. I do think that there is work being done, but it's just a matter of linking the conversations together.
The interventions. And I think for young people, I think we will try not to get tired, not to get too irritated, or not to be tired of our advocacy. We need to channel our energy into that. I think we need to be in their faces more. That's what I try to say. We need to be very, I mean, we're already very innovative and creative about our approaches, and now if we want them to hear us, we know various ways to maneuver and go about it. For instance, in Nigeria, what we did with the NDCs, so when we looked at our NDC and we realized that it didn't particularly capture young people or children or youth. So one thing that my colleague Chiagazi, one thing he did when we were working together on that, when we were just brainstorming and we thought, you know what, Nigeria at that point was about to submit the NDCs, was trying to enhance the NDCs at that time, the interim submission. And then we realized that this was missing. And what we did was of course, we reached out to some organizations if they were interested, if this was something they were interested in. We had a group, funny enough, so this happened 2019 was the first COP that I attended in Madrid. So when we were in Madrid, about 4 to 5 just young Nigerians, we met, we just discussed, you know, we're just having very casual conversations. And this came up, and you know what, we were like, when we get back to Nigeria, we're going to see what we want to do about it. And we actually sat down, we brainstormed, we talked about, okay, what can we do about this? Coincidentally, it was at the point where Nigeria was trying to enhance the NDCs. And we went back and forth, and we organized a youth consultation. It was actually, that was the first ever youth consultation that was happening in Nigeria. And it was virtually, because it was even during the COVID period. We found our way, we used our networking, connected. We were able to reach out to the Minister of Environment in Nigeria, the Honorable Minister of Environment, Madam Sharon. And we spoke with her, and she was very impressed with what we were doing. And at that point, we held this virtual webinar. We had almost about 300 young Nigerians from across Nigeria. They actually attended. In fact, we even had some that were not in Nigeria. And they were very keen. You could see that the interest was there, but they never had an opportunity to say, you know, we have something to contribute to the NDCs. And so it was through that channel, there was this, at the end of the day, we had a very simple Google document where there were contributions, we edited it, drafted it, and then we made an official recommendation to the Ministry of Environment there in Nigeria. And even that part of what that led to is that there was a launch of some youth working group as an engagement mechanism between the youth group interested in that, in different thematic areas. If you're interested in agriculture, transport, gender, whatever it is, with the Ministry of Environment. I think the UNNDP sort of supported in that regard too. So I'm just giving this illustration. These are some of the, and I think even after we did that, some young people in Yongos replicated that in their countries. They had youth consultations with the Ministries of Environment, with people in decision makers that were interested, and they were able to, you know, get them to also be interested in what they're doing. And they managed to do that. So those are some of the things that young people can do. Those are some of the actions they can take. They have to be willing, we have to be willing to be proactive, because that's the truth. If we keep saying, oh, they will never listen, if we talk, they wouldn't listen, it's very convenient for them not to listen, but we have to put in that extra energy, extra motivation to want to do it, because at the end of the day, we're the ones that will suffer the consequences of the climate crisis more. They're old, they've had a good life, they're enjoying it. We're the ones that are going to be here. So the earlier we start channeling our energy into it and not getting tired too soon, the better it will be for us. So that's just one way to go about it.
Thank you. And before asking if you have any remarks, any responses to that, I just wanted to thank Sauka and Angela for their time. I know they have to get back to negotiations, but thank you both for being here. All right, thank you all. Henrietta, do you want to respond to that as well?
I feel like everyone has covered it quite well. So I'm not going to go into like how government should be taking more action, because they should. And I feel a lot of things that we've seen is all about community and is all about local scale, because especially if you're not really integrated within, you know, this kind of environment, and you don't really know about international events, that kind of stuff. And I think what's really important is local empowerment and empowering each other. For example, as I mentioned before, it's deconstructing those patriarchal systems that are allowing the degradation of women's rights, for example, thanks to climate change. And I think just talking to people about it and just letting people know and saying, this is what's happening, this is what needs to be done about it, and trying to create a better environment around you, a better society, if everyone takes those smaller steps, and deconstructing, as I said, those patriarchal norms that allow it to happen, I feel like is one of the best ways. To be able to do it in a smaller environment without having to have all the knowledge in the world about what's happening, because you might not, because the education system isn't there that has provided us with that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I do have other questions, but I want to open the floor to anyone here that would like to come up to the mic and ask a question either to the whole panel or one of the speakers. So please feel free to do that, or any virtual participants as well. We have a little screen there that can help us with that if you are all at home and want to ask questions. But if not, I do have other things as well, so feel free to come up. Yeah, can you come up to the mic? Thank you. And if anyone else wants to already make their way to the mic, we have a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much for this panel today. And I'd like to ask you, Zainab, I completely agree with you, and I am ready to take that step. But I still feel if we are not being listened, or rather, I am kind of disturbed and annoyed with the fact that we would be responsible for taking this extra step. I want to take it. I want to make change happen. But is it our responsibility, you know, to take this step? Is it our responsibility to get stakeholders listen to us? And I'd like to know your opinion on this. I said, like, this step, okay, we can take it. We have the power to take it. But is it our responsibility to fill this gap, you know? Thank you.
I mean, in an ideal situation, it shouldn't be our responsibility. This is my opinion. This is how I feel about it. In an ideal situation, it shouldn't be our responsibility. We ought to be looked after. Our needs are supposed to be met and given adequate consideration. Unfortunately, it isn't. And I think maybe it's easier for me because, and I think many Nigerians, probably Africans, can relate. For us, it's always about survival, and for us, we've taken that as our responsibility. It's almost like if we don't look out for ourselves, nobody would do that. So it's still better in the developed world where, you know, everything seems to be working better. Some of these, people understand their rights, they're being recognized, they're being respected. It's a better climb to what is happening. So for us, we've always grown with this survival mentality of we have to do it ourselves. We have to take these steps because if you don't do it, nobody will do it for you. In an ideal situation, we shouldn't be. But, you know, you also wait. Who's going to lose more if you don't take that step? You understand? I think that's where I always come from. If I don't do it and because I'm angry, we should be angry. We have every right to be angry. But you know what? Let's channel that anger into something that will give us a bigger result, something that will be a win-win for us. So that's what I always try to encourage whenever I have the opportunity to speak. That's always what I always try to push for, to promote. Let's try to put them to shame. I always put it that way. Let's try to tell them that, you know what, this was something you could have done for us. You're not doing it. We're trying to do it for ourselves. We're trying to, in Nigeria, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but in Nigeria, there's this popular phrase when you say lazy Nigerian youth. It's an unfortunate phrase that we've taken on ourselves because it was our president that even used that to describe us. But we didn't let that discourage us. We now use it as a way to motivate ourselves. We're like, are you going to be a lazy Nigerian youth? No. Okay then, you know what, let's take it upon ourselves and do this. In some cases, strange enough, in some cases, what we've realized is that they just don't know. In some cases, we realize that if they are unaware of these realities. It's a different thing to live in a comfortable space and be reading about things and all, but then experiencing it. Some people, some of these decision makers that we've approached, they just don't know they're not in touch with reality. They don't know what is going on. They don't know that these are actual situations. So sometimes, you know, if you sit back there and think, okay, you should know, and it's in a case where they actually have good intentions, but they don't know, that's not an excuse. They should know for them to be in that position, but, you know, so I would always encourage you to be proactive and take a step wherever you can.
Thank you, Zainab. Do we have other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is a really inspiring and awesome conversation here. My question is, if as young feminists, there's conversations happening with the older feminists, and I consider myself one of them in her 40s, to perhaps make sure that whenever we're in a gender space, that there's also a youth rep right there. I know access is really challenging in a COVID setting, and we have these limited tickets, you know, to go into spaces, negotiations. And within a feminist space or a gender space, you can often have a prioritizing of experience, you know, quotes, which ends up being a little bit of a gatekeeping exercise within the feminist space. And just curious if there's been conversations to make sure whenever we have our gender or feminist rep that's side by side, ensuring that the youth voice is elevated in that space also.
Does anyone want to comment on that? Yeah, Renata?
I completely agree. As someone that's not even at university yet, I know what it's like for youth not to be heard. And I feel like that's very prevalent within many conversations. Obviously, if it's intersectional, then it should also be intergenerational and include everyone, every part of that community that is being affected, every stakeholder. And I feel like, yeah, in short, it's paramount that young people are included in our conversations because it's our future. And I hope for a better world and that it's more brighter and more sustainable and more just. But that's not going to happen if it's not including every voice. And I feel like as we see with the COP26 top team where it's dominated by men, as are most governments, I think you see a lot of the women that are there are older women and not younger women. And I think that potentially is also, another reason as to why there are so many barriers for young people to get into politics and make those changes, but also is a reason why there has been a lack of action because we haven't got this new youth voice. It shouldn't be the case, any politician should be there to represent everyone and to create a better world, but that evidently isn't really happening in most cases, but it is getting better the more that we listen to young people.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if, formally these discussions have been made, but I think informally, definitely there's been a critique amongst youth on, the whole celebritization of, some young climate activists, right? And, I mean, of course, it's important to push a young narrative, youth narrative, but, using one person as a microcosm of what all young people think is just not realistic, and it's never representative because typically, as we've seen in the media often glorifies the work of a white, young climate activist, and that erases a lot of voices of, for instance, Black women, like Karina mentioned in her discussion. So I think that is quite the danger of just focusing on a few select people to speak on behalf of all of us and all of our experiences, when in fact they're obviously very diverse. Yeah, I mean, even in regards to the traditional critiques of feminism, right? A lot of that was not inclusive of not just younger people, but it was very exclusive to people of color. And so I think that there's still tensions within a movement anyways that need to be kind of unpacked. But I do know that at least informally when I talk to my friends, this is a discussion that definitely exists because I think a lot of young feminists and also especially feminists of color feel like their voices are being overlooked and they're not participating even when there is some kind of youth quota. They're not the ones who are being invited, so yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Can I take 2 more questions, and then if you want to comment on these, you can definitely. So yeah, if you can ask your question and then we can then as a panel respond to them. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the inspiring talk so far today. I was really interested in how some of you mentioned the ways that sometimes discourses on sexual and reproductive rights and health can be used within the climate change space, particularly around discussions around population. And I wondered how we could safeguard against aspects of SRHR being used potentially in an instrumental way that don't actually prioritize human rights, women's and other people's bodies, and what kind of actions we could take to make sure that the conversation remains centered in bodily autonomy and not sort of co-opted in a way that could instrumentalize women and their reproductive capacities for population reduction, for example.
Thank you. Could we take your question as well?
Well, I'm a climate activist from Chile, Latin America, and here in Chile, Argentina, and other places on Latin America, we have the aborto libre y gratuito, the free abortion movement with the pañuelo verde, with the green, I don't know how to say pañuelo on English, but okay. And one thing that annoys me a lot is that when you try to speak with people that are really conservative and are the part of the decision making to such an important sexual reproductive thing that we need, how do you do and how you manage to change that energy that it's angry, that is sadness and everything, to speak with people that are really close to hear you. What do you do, and what are the things that maybe you like meditate or something to make the change and feel free to to empower other women and make your activism? Thank you.
Thank you both for the questions. So anyone that want to take either one or the two questions, please take the floor.
I think for me, with what the first question about how we can try to push it away, I think it first starts with awareness, and I think it's just very easy if one understands what feminism is and what feminism advocates for. It's very easy to use that to back when you're trying to push it away from the aspect of mitigation. And I think it's very big on languaging, on how we word it and how we put it in maybe policies, on how we center the message around it, on the kind of narrative that we want to promote and that we want to debunk. I think that's a that would be an effective way of going about it. When you try to raise this awareness, when you're speaking, and then every opportunity that we get to talk about this, to discuss it, whether it's conferences, activities, event, I think just right there when we're trying to advocate for what SRHR linkage it with climate change, I think the next line to come after is to refute, sort of debunk this about population, about mitigation. So it's like we're doing those two things together so that the word spread, the explanation, people understand. And it's not just telling people, oh, don't do this. It's also explaining why. People need to understand that if you go about it that way, then you're not solving any problem. You're just placing women in an unfortunate situation again. You're just placing them in that position where they do not want to be, where you're pretending to uplift them. And it could be knowingly or unknowingly. Because if you look at it, they'll be like, oh, okay, when you do meet the SRHR needs, oh, population is a problem with the carbon and this and that. But in the end, you do not care about the person. The center of the whole thing is the woman, is the girl involved. And it's not about her in the end if you go about it that way. It's all about let us meet her needs. So I think we need to be very careful with our languaging. We need to raise our awareness. We need to take the issue of avoiding the use of it as a mitigation strategy. We need to push it as much with the same effort with which we're pushing this interlinkage between climate change impact and SRHR. I think that way we can help with what is going on already.
Thank you, Zainab. I know we're almost at time, but if you want to make some quick comments on the questions, lovely to hear from you. Or maybe last closing remarks before we conclude.
I feel like the two questions can kind of be quickly linked. Is a lot of as you said about the language used, I think it's when I'm taking an example as politicians in the UK, for example, a lot of the high-profile politicians don't exactly and in the past haven't exactly used the kindest language about women or about many marginalised communities for that matter. And I feel like that links in with the whole system, which is allowing us to put this blame on, for example, black women or people in the global south and saying about population and not actually talking about the issues with that. The government's working with oil giants and not young people, or governments have not mentioned anything about gender in their NDCs, but they talk a lot about the future of technology, and I feel like so much of that is down to the language and how we interact with our politicians, and call them out for it, and say, and use your power of your voting, for example, by saying, why on earth are you allowed to be the highest decision maker and not care actually about your people? So that's my point.
Thank you. Do you want to say something before we end?
Yeah, I think your question was really interesting, and I think it like raises a really important point about like how people can get co-opted so easily, and like terms can get co-opted so easily, and I think that happens a lot with like obviously women's rights, but also just being like a youth. And so I think like we have to be like cognizant of when we're actually understanding what the purpose is when somebody wants to supposedly work with us or say that they have something, that they have our best interests at heart, because that might not always be the case, and that if that is, you know, if they have something more malicious in their mind, then we have to have some kind of counter narrative to kind of counteract these false pieces of information. Yeah, and I think that in general, I think one thing I've learned from living in different parts of Asia, especially where, you know, maybe freedom of expression was not the same as, you know, being in Japan or the US and Canada, or, you know, where else, the UK, but I think sometimes we also have this linear understanding of what it means to be like an activist or a feminist, and we think that it just means like protesting all the time, and some people think that, not everyone, but you know, I think that that's not always the case, and especially in countries where maybe having this overt form of expression can actually get you killed, or, you know, put you in a very precarious situation. You have to understand that it doesn't mean that they're not resisting. They just find other ways of expressing their resistance. So I think that also, like, while we're sitting here and we're able to have this platform and speak, also we should be looking at like the different ways that maybe people are subtly resisting, and it's not always, you know, sitting on these panels and having a protest outside. It's, you know, it can be through art or music, and so I think attention to that diversity is also really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else before we wrap up? All right, that was very, very powerful. I hope you're all leaving here more inspired and more ready to continue the next few days of COP. I did want to direct it to a few resources before we end so we can continue these discussions. One of them is the UNFPA website, which has resources on climate change and sexual, reproductive, and health and rights. We also have the NDC Equity Tracker, ndcequitytracker.org, which is where a lot of these analyses that we talked about are hosted, so please do take a look. And finally, empoderaclima.org is our resource for content on gender and climate in different languages. I know we talked about language barriers, so in Brazil we often talk about tropicalizing those issues, the Paris Agreement, the Gender Action Plan. So you can find those resources in Portuguese, Spanish, French as well, so we can shift away a little bit from this English narrative the whole time. So I'll end just saying that please continue the work you're doing. Please focus on girls' education specifically, focus on including young women specifically in decision-making spaces, giving them those spaces if you can, if you have that power, because as you have been able to see in this last hour and 15 minutes, they're so powerful, young people are so powerful, and it can really change the world if we really have them in the decision-making tables, being able to have their voice heard, being able to have their power to achieve climate justice. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay.